The Sikha is Chelek Yutes Vaeschanan Aleph. In this week's parsha we have Shema. The parsha of Vaeschanan includes the Shema, and part of the Shema are the words Vishinantam Livanecha V'Dibarta Bam. So therefore today's Sikha is going to be on the topic of Limud HaTorah, the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, of learning Torah and teaching Torah. In the mitzvah from Talmud Torah, in the mitzvah of learning Torah, there are generally speaking two commandments. Aleph Lilmoid, the chiyuv kishayakir to learn in Torah, the mitzvah to learn Torah, that a person should learn Torah on his own. Kishayakir, once he becomes conscious, aware of this mitzvah, he should start learning Torah. The word kishayakir comes from the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah, that he says if someone who his father did not teach him Torah, then chayiv lelamed es atzmai kishayakir. Once he realizes that he hasn't learned Torah, or he's not learning Torah, then he becomes obligated to teach himself to learn Torah. So that's the first thing, lilmoid. Beis lilamda, to teach Torah, to learn in Torah mit andere, to teach Torah to others, ubifrat, specifically afin vater, to learn mit seine zin, a father to learn with his sons. So we have two details. Number one, a person should learn Torah. Number two, a person should teach Torah, and specifically a father has a mitzvah to teach his children Torah. Gefind ben Dvar Pella, we find on this something very interesting. Side der Rambam und side der Alter Rebbe haben on Hilchos Talmud Torah nicht mit dem Din, als man ist mechuyev zu lernen Torah, nor mit dem Din, als es achiyuv und mit das Essen in der Torah auf in Av zu lernen Torah mit den Yakotten. Both the Rambam in Hilchos Talmud Torah in the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Talmud Torah from the Alter Rebbe begin their halachas not with a din that a person is obligated to learn Torah, but rather with the din that a person has an obligation and a mitzvah esem and Torah as a father to learn with his children, with his children that are under bar mitzvah. This is seemingly not understood. It should have began with the obligation of learning Torah in general, meaning to say that a person has the obligation to learn. And following that, it should tell us, then he can tell us it's not enough a person should learn for himself, he also has to teach others, including or specifically his children. Der chiyuv lelamda libnei katan is da, vailas is da der chiyuv lilmei Torah. As we would understand it on a very basic level, why does a person have an obligation to teach his child? Because a person has an obligation to learn Torah. So just like in other mitzvahs, we start chinuch before bar mitzvah to prepare the child to learn Torah, to do the mitzvah. Similarly, because there's a general mitzvah of Talmud Torah, when does this mitzvah begin? Even as a child. And unlike other mitzvahs where there's only chinuch, as we'll see later on, here there's an additional tzivuy, additional mitzvah. By other mitzvahs, chinuch is midirabanan. By Talmud Torah, there's a specific mitzvah to begin to learn Torah with a child also. But where does that tzivui originate from? Seemingly from the mitzvah of learning. That not only a person should learn, but a person should begin to teach his children. So the Cheder, the Alter Rebbe, the Rambam should have started their halachas with a mitzvah of learning Torah. Ubifrat, as es kenit sein der lelamda on dem frier die can lilmit. Especially since you can't teach without learning first. So first you have to learn, then you could teach. Und wie says the divrei Torah an chadudim beficha, so much so that the Gemara in Kiddushin says, and Rashi brings it down on the pasuk Vishinantam levanecha. But why did it say Vishinantam, not Vilamadata levanecha? The word Vishinantam. So he says that the words of Torah should be mechudadim beficha. It should be fluent in your mouth. That if somebody asks you a question, you shouldn't have to stutter, and you shouldn't have to you shouldn't have to hesitate before telling them the answer. You should be able to tell right away. So Vishinantam levanecha means not just that you should learn first. You should learn first in a level that that the words that you're teaching are fluent. So the question is, first of all, the whole basis is the mitzvah of learning Torah. Second of all, you can't learn without teaching. So why would the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam begin their halachas of Talmud Torah with the mitzvah of teaching before talking about the mitzvah of learning? Seemingly we can explain this for the following two reasons. And these two reasons are going to become relevant again and again during the Sikha. So therefore, we should make sure that we understand what these two reasons are. Aleph, even though the Rebbe is going to ask on them, but we're going to get back to that. We're going to get back to them. These are going to become the foundations of the message of the Sikha. Since there is an obligation min ha-Torah to learn with a child, and unlike the rest of the mitzvahs, that there's no obligation min ha-Torah to educate the children. The chinuch of ktanim is midrabanan, but by Torah there is an obligation to learn with the children. Kumtois, as the limud ha-Torah bei jeden einem muss sich anfangen und fängt sich an min ha-Torah wenn ist noch a. Since there's a mitzvah to teach the children, therefore, when does the person become obligated to learn Torah? When he's still a child. Even though the obligation is on the father to teach him, but nevertheless, this child, there is an obligation that this child should be learning Torah. Und der Riber heben sich an Hilchas Talmud Torah mit den Dienen wegen Limud HaTorah von Aiden. Then sie heben sich an bei jedem. And therefore Hilchas Talmud Torah begins at the earliest stage when Torah becomes an obligation on the person, which is when they're still a child. And since the child can't necessarily learn themselves, and nor do they have an obligation on the child because they're still a child, the obligation is on the father to teach him, to hire a teacher. But the idea is that since the beginning of the obligation is when the person is still a child, therefore that's where the halachas begin, when the person is a child. That's point number one. Point number two, base. The tzivui of Talmud Torah is nichpol pa'amim rabbis. The tzivui for learning Torah is mentioned a number of times in Torah. Side der tzivui lilmait, both the command for a person to learn Torah. For example, in this week's parsha it says, Ushmartem va'asisem ki hi chochmaschem ubinaschem le'nei ha'amim, and Rashi says Ushmartem is Mishnah. Then there's a pasuk in our parsha, V'zeis ha-mitzvah ha-chukim va-mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeichem le'lamed eschem, again, to learn Torah, the chukim and the mishpatim to learn. And of course we have the Vaeschanan levanecha. So you have, even in our parsha, there's already a number of places where it says it. Inside the tzivui lelamda. And also the tzivui of teaching. For example, in our parsha, again, it says, V'idaitam levanecha v'livnei vanecha, which is the mitzvah of teaching Torah. As well as Vaeshanantam levanecha v'dibartam is also a mitzvah not just to learn, but to teach. So you have a number of places throughout Torah. The words nichpol pa'amim rabbis comes from the Rambam. Now this is something the Rambam says, וכבר נכבל זה הציווי פעמים רבש, ולמדתם ועשיתם למען ילמדון, וכבר נספזר הציווי והזירר על מצווה זו במקיימס רבים מן התלמוד. So the idea is that the mitzvah to learn Torah is in many places throughout Torah, aber der tzivui ikri, the primary commandment, the dervas wird gebracht in Minyan mitzvahs from Rambam. The one that is brought in the list of mitzvahs from the Rambam is Vaeshanantam levanecha, is the mitzvah that you should teach your children. But is koilel with the Rambam zagdart, which this pasuk includes lilmei Torah ulilamda, to both learn Torah and to teach Torah. Und wie bald as der Makir ikri af en chiyuv von limud ha-Torah eich von lilmeit is from Vaeshanantam levanecha, and since the main primary source for the mitzvah of learning Torah, learning and teaching, is from Vaeshanantam levanecha, was named the pastors b'nei hakatan, which on the most basic level means to teach a child, but yet it includes the learning of the adults as well. Der Riber hebt sich an Hilchas Talmud Torah mit dem chiyuv ala av zu lernen Torah b'nei hakatan. Therefore, the Hilchas Talmud Torah begins with the obligation upon the father to teach Torah to his child, because Vaeshanantam levanecha is the source. So there's two nukudas over here. Number one, that learning Torah, the obligation to learn Torah begins from childhood. Number two, the source for learning Torah, even of adults, is from Vaeschanan Levanecha. And for these two reasons, both the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam begin their Hilchos Talmud Torah with the laws of teaching children. Das Guf is Labardeir's beer. However, this itself demands an explanation. For was tak is mitzvahs Talmud Torah uisketelt von alle mitzvahs. Why are we differentiating the mitzvah of Talmud Torah from all the other mitzvahs? The Aleph as limud Torah tashayches mit Torah echt katan. That learning Torah has a connection even to a katan more than any other mitzvah, which the other mitzvahs chinuch is midrabanan. Und nachmer as der chiyuv to learn in Torah is nichlal in the mitzvah Vaeschanan Levanecha, and even more so that the commandment to learn Torah even of adults is a part of the tzivah Vaeschanan Levanecha. Why is there a greater connection between Torah and children than mitzvahs and children? Why do we find in these two details that when it comes to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, there is a deeper connection between the mitzvah of Talmud Torah and children? So, in Seif Beis, he's going to give a suggestion for an answer, and he's going to say that it's trying to emphasize to us the fact that the learning that we do today in Galus, before Bias HaMashiach, is like a child's play. Like the learning of a child compared to the Limud HaTorah, which will be done Lasid Lavai. Seemingly we can say that the reason why the Alter Rebbe and the Rambam begin the mitzvahs of Talmud Torah, or why we find an intrinsic connection between Limud Torah and the learning of children, is because it wants to emphasize to us the difference between learning Torah in nowadays and learning Torah lost love when Mashiach comes. Move on to Pasha, it's understood as when Yidden will have the time in order to learn Torah and to delve into its wisdom. When the Yidden will be great scholars, the world will be filled with knowledge. Knowledge and wisdom and truth will increase, which is all wording references to the time of Mashiach. The learning Torah will be, and the understanding of Torah will be on a much greater level compared to today. Chazal tell us as the Torah was learned is hevel. The Torah was learned lost love of Mashiach. The Torah that we learn today is air. It's nothingness compared to the Torah that we will learn lost love when Mashiach comes, or from Mashiach. Is there close limud Torah bisman hazeh afilu fun gedolim nitmer v'alimud von hakatan, and therefore the learning that we do today, even the learning of the adults, is nothing more than just a child learning compared to the learning that we'll do lasid lavei. Another nekuda. Just like when the child is learning, it's part of his training, which is preparing him for his primary obligation when he'll become an adult. You can say the same thing with regards to learning Torah in this world. As that the learning that we do today is a preparation and a training for the learning Torah that will happen when Mashiach comes. Once the person has his learning in his hand, which means to say that in this world he learned as much as he can, then we will be able to receive the learning of Torah b'shleimusay in a more complete form from Mashiach. So it could be that in order to make this point, that we should know that as much as we learn Torah today, it's only hevel, it's only like a cotton learning compared to the learning Torah when Mashiach comes. So it could be that this is why there's such a connection between limud Torah and the cotton. However, this explanation is insufficient. This idea that our learning of today is only child's play compared to the learning when Mashiach comes, could be said the same thing about the rest of the mitzvahs. Like the Lashon is said, as the mitzvahs was me seine mekayim be'elam hazeh, seinen ziyunim, to the mitzvahs was me mekayim sein lasid lavei. This is a sifri that says that the mitzvahs are like signposts. When a person leaves, when they go somewhere, they leave signposts so they should know how to come back. When the Yidden left to Golus, they left Eretz Yisrael into Golus. They left signposts to be able to know how to come back. And what are those signposts? The mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are also called Siyunim because Mitsuyonim bazeh, the Yidden excel in them. But the idea that we see is that mitzvahs are called signposts. They're emblematic to the mitzvahs of Mekayim Zayin Lasad Lavai compared to the mitzvahs that will be fulfilled when Mashiach comes. Then the mitzvahs will be done as the Eibusher commanded, as the Eibusher wants, in the ultimate and complete way. Today, it's only a sign. It's only an icon compared to what is going to be done when Mashiach comes. Das heißt, as eich kiyam mitzvahs be'elam hazeh is not rebchinas katnus. Tziyunim legabi kiyam mitzvahs lasad lavi, which means to say that the mitzvahs that we do today are only child's play compared to the mitzvahs of lasad lavi. Und as das is mehai time a gufa achinuch va'achanu tzatlemes kiyam mitzvahs. And using the same point that we use with regards to the limud HaTorah, that learning Torah today is a preparation to the limud HaTorah when Mashiach comes. We can say the same thing about the mitzvahs. That the mitzvahs that we do today, because it's only rebchinas katnus, is a preparation for the time that we will do the mitzvahs properly when Mashiach comes. So we see the same idea in mitzvahs as we do with regards to Torah. Aber von dem was die mitzvahs Talmud Torah davke hat a shayches eich zu a cotton. Yet we find that Talmud Torah has a shayches to the cotton more than mitzvahs do. Und noch mehr, echt der Tzivui klali of Talmud Torah wird nichlul und angesagt durch Vaeschanan levanecha. Not only do the children have an obligation to learn Torah, but even the learning of the adults is learned from Vaeschanan levanecha, from the mitzvah of teaching the children, is muvan, as in Talmud Torah is da ninyi meyuchad as a shayach davke to the mitzvahs Talmud Torah. So therefore it's understood that in learning Torah there's something unique, that is unique to the mitzvah of limud HaTorah, that connects to the learning of the child, or of children, and we have to understand why that is. And based on that, we'll understand why the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe begin with Hilchas Talmud Torah, with learning of children, because there's an intrinsic connection between Limud HaTorah and the learning of children. And in the next two Seifim, he's going to explain the connection, and he's going to explain the idea of bittul. That when a Yid learns Torah, there has to be bittul. And that's the connection with the cotton, because a person has to make themselves small in order to learn Torah. And there's going to be two ideas in bittul, which the two ideas in bittul will correspond to the two details that we learned in Seif Aleph. Number one, that learning Torah begins from when the person is still a child. And number two, that the learning Torah of adults is learned from the pasuk that tells us to learn with children. So let's take one step at a time. First we have to introduce a difference between Torah and mitzvahs. Mitzvahs was werden getan mit dvarim gashmiyim. The mitzvahs which are primarily done with physical objects is ikir in yanan zu uftan in die dvarim in Welt. The main goal is to impact the things, the objects with which the mitzvah is being done, which means to impact the world. And similar to the expression, that the person impacts the object. How does he impact it? To refine and uplift the physical object and the koiches of his nefesh abamis, which are being used for the mitzvah. Because it's being used for a mitzvah, it refines it and elevates it, transforms it. Underiber. So since the whole purpose is to impact the thing, not so much the person, Underiber. Af al pi as mitzvahs darf man bekayim zayin mit bittul. So even though still mitzvahs need bittul, in other words, nit val hazeh is mechayiv seichel. We don't do a mitzvah because seichel tells us to. Nor val hazeh is the ratzonali. We do the mitzvah because the Eibusher wants us to do so. Asher kitchanu b'mitzvah savitzi vanor. The Eibusher commanded us to do the mitzvah. So there is still an element of bittul there. But von deswegen, nevertheless, is the ikir zachen kiyam mitzvahs. The primary detail in the mitzvah, the most important ingredient, is the asiyah, the deed, the action. Der Bittel, ubechlolos kloschen Chazal, das was mitzvah seine Metzara v'sabrius, was die mitzvah darf herausrufen in dem Gavre, in mention the fact that the Bittel, the person has to stand in a bittul, or any impact that the mitzvah has on the person. For example, Chazal tell us that the mitzvahs were given in order to refine the creations, meaning to say, the people. And when a Yid does a mitzvah, it refines him. All that is nit ma'akev b'di'evet. Is not necessary, is not an absolute necessity to the mitzvah in order to be mekayim the mitzvah. If a person does a mitzvah without the kavanah, without the change, without the transformation, the mitzvah is still done. It's like an external addition to the actual fulfillment of the mitzvah. The most important ingredient in the mitzvah is the deed, doing the mitzvah. Then the mitzvah is also supposed to impact the person as well, but that's not the main thing. And if it didn't work on the person, the mitzvah was still done. So it comes to limud to mitzvah, because the mitzvah is about the thing. Therefore, the bittul, even though it's there, it's not so important. What's most important is the mitzvah should get done. Limud Torah, on the other hand, when it comes to limud Torah, is in Yonei as der Mensch soll mit sein Seichel verstehen und vereinigen sich mit dem Muskel. Here it is about the person. It's not just about the thing. That the person with his intellectual capacity should be able to become one with the concept that he's studying. Nicht wellen uisfiren wie es will sich and not that he should conclude the way he wants the conclusion to be. Nor suchen dem emes von der Haskalah but he should find the truth of the idea, of the concept, and he should break himself to go along with that. Was batera? So when we say that the person with his seichel has to become one with the muskel, which is the concept that he's studying, if he's learning Torah, what's the muskel? The Eibishter is chachma. Und der Fall is that inyan bittel and inyan ikri, bifrat in limud Torah, and therefore bittel becomes a very important ingredient. Since the Eibishter's chachma is beyond the ramifications of the person's of the person, can das nit niklet werden ba nivra, nor wenn lernt mit bittel. So the person cannot grasp it, he cannot absorb it unless there's bittel there. Then learnt nor mit keach seichel. If he only uses the seichel without bittel, can es him interfere into seine megala panamatera like halacha. It could lead to actually interpreting the Torah wrong, not as the halacha is. Why? Because because he's using his seichel, so his wisdom works. The ideas that he's introducing are good. It's not the Eibishter's chachma. It's not the halacha, because he didn't create that connection with the muskel, with chachmas yizbarach. So if a person lacks bittul, he won't be able to cross the bridge from his limited, his finite seichel to the infinite seichel to the infinite chachma of the Eibishter. And because of that, things can make a lot of sense, and they can be totally inconsistent with halacha. Und der Far sagen Chazal, therefore Chazal tell us, as es muss sein Baruch hu b'Torah tchila, that first you have to make a birchas HaTorah first. Als Akdame v'Yesod zu limud HaTorah muss früher sein birchas HaTorah. Before a person could sit down to learn Torah, he has to make the brachas. Vus is mudgish der Inyan von v'nasan lano es Torah soy. Where in the bracha we emphasize that the Eibishter gave us his Torah. Und das ruft reis beim Leimid dem Bittul zum Neisten Torah, which this draws out within the person a bittul to the Eibishter who gave us the Torah. Was durch dem wird Kli Aroi zu Torah Savaya, and that's how he becomes a fitting receptacle to the Torah of Hashem. So this is the first idea of bittul, that before the person even approaches to learn Torah, he has to recognize that the Torah is from the Eibishter, and in order for him to reach that high level, that his seichel should become one with the Eibishter's chachma, he has to have bittul, and bittul therefore becomes a primary ingredient in this process. Dalet. Now we're going to learn about another aspect of the bittul. Just like the necessity to have bittul. as a preparation to learning Torah, as a foundation to the learning Torah, which this makes him b'chlal a keli, makes it even possible for him to grasp and to absorb, to take in the Torah of Hashem. Also, we have the necessity, the need for bittul of the learner while he is learning, and also over here we're going to contrast this with mitzvahs, that it's more necessary when learning than it is by mitzvahs. By kiyum mitzvahs, wenn der Mensch ist mit seinem Mekayim Kiddeboy, weil hat der Eibishter angesagt Kanal, when a person does a mitzvah because the Eibishter says so and he does it properly, is in sein Ton die Mitzvah nicht reingemischt in eigene Mitzvahs. When he does the mitzvah, it doesn't involve so much his own ego, his own being. Steht mir lechatchile in der Tnua von folgendem Eibishter's Ansag. He from the get-go is in a state of following the Eibishter's command. Is there by nit as a natik to bavaran as muzan the aveda von bittel, and therefore it's not so necessary to tell him that there has to be the aveda of bittel, because he's already in some state of bittul. In other words, his Metzias is not playing such a role. He's following the commands of the Eibishter. But Torah aber, however, when it comes to learning Torah, since, as we said before, the idea of learning Torah is the oneness, is the unification of the person's seichel with the muskel, with the concept, which in this case is the Eibishter's chachma. Das heißt, as when it is mechaven lamitas shel Torah, when the person zeroes in on understanding the truth of Torah, is as be'efen as the svarda vasar haravet uis mit zayin seichel, is as kiviyachal chachmasi yisbarach. How does he reach that? Through using his own seichel. When his own seichel invests the effort to understand, then his seichel becomes one with the Eibishter. But because of that, his seichel is playing a major role here. The person himself is playing a role. Darf man bavaranen, as in dem sollen sich nicht reinmischen pnies und sheichas von tenegenem seichel und metzias. We have to make sure that he should not involve any motives, any ulterior motives, any bias of his own seichel, his own metzias. When it comes to a mitzvah, we say do. So when he's doing, it's not so much about the person; it's about the action. But when we talk on learning Torah, the whole way to learn is by employing his seichel. And his seichel, if it doesn't have bittul with it, then his seichel can lead him in the right direction. And he explains what's the problem. Before we said the problem is the Torah is going to make sense, the Sfara is going to make sense, but it's disconnected from the Eibishter's Chacham. Here he says a different issue. Here he says the layman Torah can make a mistake. He could think that he's on a level that the only thing that's important to him, that's relevant to him, is the truth of Torah. When Imit says, so if someone's going to come and say opposite, different than the way his seichel concludes, so he sees it as if that person is going against the Torah. As Chazal tell us in the Gemara in Tainis, I printed it out. If you see a member of the Chachamim that becomes angry, you should know that what's getting angry, because he's a Talmud Chacham, he's not getting angry because of personal things. He's getting angry in the name of the Torah. So, using that idea, he says a person is not in a perfect state of bittul, might think of himself that he is already at a level that it's all important to him is the truth, and therefore when he sees someone else getting angry, disagreeing with him, he's going to get angry, not for himself, he's going to get angry for the Torah, because the other person is saying the wrong thing. Be'ez as in eder emison is der val der gosse as im art. When in truth, What's really bothering him is the fact that the other person is going against him, or also the fact that the person is going against him. Und der Riber, therefore his learning Torah has to be permeated with bittul, zu verhitten, as die eigene Metzies wie Yeshes, soll sich nicht reinmischen und meschachet sein und matte sein, seine Gias HaSeichel, to protect that his own ego and his own being should not involve itself to bias or to lean his seichel in the verstehen Megals and Chachmas Yisbarach, to be in the effort to understand and reveal the Eibus's Chachma. So there's two inyanim in bittul. Number one, the limit, there's an inyan in learning a Torah, which is to become one with the muskel, to become one with Chachmas Yisbarach. And therefore, you need to have, when you're realizing what you're about to do, you're about to learn the Eibus's Torah. So before you even approach it, you have to Baruch Hu Tchila. You have to recognize that it's the Eibus's Torah, and you have to approach it with a bittul. Because if Chas Shalom you don't have the bittul, then you'll end up paskening Chelek halacha. Then there's another aspect in Torah. The other aspect in Torah is the fact that he's using his seichel. In other words, the first aspect was, where is he going with the seichel? He's going to the muscle, he's going to Chachmas Yisbarach. The other aspect of Torah is that using his seichel. And therefore, when he uses his seichel, it can make him feel important. My seichel is able to reach the Eibus's Chachma. And because of that, there might be pniyas, and there might be sheichat in understanding the Torah. He might come to a point that he sees the other person telling him something that disagreeing with him, and he might think that the other person is going Hepech Torah, when in truth, the other person is going Hepech him. And therefore, not only as a hakdama to the learning Torah, but even during the learning Torah, it has to be permeated with a bittul to make sure that his yeshes, that his ego does not get involved and get in the way of revealing the truth, the amitas shel Torah. So these are the two inyanim in bittul. And now in Sif Hey, he's going to explain how these two inyanim in bittul are consistent with the two pratim that we brought in Sif Aleph about the connection between limud HaTorah and children. This can also be used to explain these two ideas. The whole idea of learning Torah begins from when the person is a child. The idea of the command, the mitzvah of learning Torah of the adult is included in the commandment. Because in these two ideas about learning Torah are expressed these two ideas of bittul that are necessary and required by the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. That which limud Torah begins when the person is a child. One might say that the mitzvah of learning with a child begins from 6 or whenever chinuch begins. But midrabanon, the mitzvah of learning Torah with a child begins even before the child is a child. As soon as the child has any connection to understanding something, as soon as the child is able to begin to speak, there's already a mitzvah to teach him Torah. So the fact that we're starting to learn Torah from a child who's just learning how to speak is not even that he understands so much. Is madgish, this emphasizes, as the haschala v'yesod from limud HaTorah, is need the seichel shebetorah, that the foundation of learning is not so much the understanding, because the child doesn't even understand it yet, nor their mamit umaktin atzmei, what's the necessity for the person to make themselves small. Their bittul zum neisten HaTorah shel ma'alim v'tam v'das, the bittul to the Eibishter. Was derin in a bittul is not abhängig from gadlus v'seichel. This aspect of bittul is not dependent on maturity or on seichel, nor there is faran by yedrin afilu batinik mishidei ledaber mitzad nishmasei. But you don't need to be an adult to have bittul on this level. Even a child is just beginning to learn how to speak. Mitzad his neshama already has this connection to the Eibishter. So this first concept of bittul, that as Yesod v'Hakdama to learning Torah, you have to have a bittul, is consistent with the idea that learning Torah begins as a child, as a very small child. That just like learning Torah begins as a very small child who's not shayach tavan of asaga and is sechakel learning with a bittul because he's a child, so too, whenever we learn Torah, it has to be with a Yesod v'Hakdama of bittul. Und der zweite Prat. And the second detail that we discussed for the first Seif, das was euch der Tzivu auf Limud HaTorah von HaGodel wird nichlel im Tzivu v'shnantem levanecha. The fact that even the mitzvah for a gadol, for an adult to learn Torah, is included in Vaeschanan levanecha. From that teaches us as euch be'ez dem limud gufa, that even during the learning, when he is in them areingetam mit dem kayach haseichel, wie the limud for a gadol, when it's an adult style learning, a learning that's utilizing seichel, mit avon of asaga, with comprehension and understanding. It's still It's still coming from the mitzvah of learning with a child, because it has to also be permeated with bittul. So what we did here, incredibly, is we took these two ideas, that number one, learning Torah begins from childhood, and number two, the learning Torah of adults is learned from learning with a child. And we connected it with the two levels of two ideas of bittul that are necessary. Number one, before you start learning, you have to approach learning with bittul. And number two, while you're learning, it has to be with bittul, so you don't involve your own seichel in a way of yeshes and in a way of getting distracted from amitasa shel Torah. And we connected it with these two ideas, that number one, you begin learning Torah with a child, which represents that bittul, that limud that Torah has to be on the foundation of bittul, and with vishinantam levanecha, that the learning of the adult has to also be with bittul, meaning to say also the havana vasaga during the learning has to also be with bittul. And now we understand why both the Alter Rebbe and the the Rambam and others will begin Hilchos Talmud Torah with the mitzvah of learning with children, because it is emphasizing to us that there is a major connection between Limud HaTorah and children, because Limud HaTorah has to be learned like a child, meaning to say, Shemaktin es atzmai, a person has to make himself small, there has to be a bittul, side before the learning and side during the learning. Now we're going to go to Pirkei Avos, and we're going to take everything we've learned and apply it to Pirkei Avos. So we're going to take the Pirkei Avos and we're going to apply it here. We spoke many times that everything, especially in Torah, is precise and b'ashecha pratis. Is verstandig, as es da technische Scheichheit zwischen der Parshas Hashavua und der Perek in Avos, was man sagt und belernt in dem betreffenden Shabbos. So we must conclude that there is a connection in the message of the parsha of the week and the Perek in Pirkei Avos, which we are learning on the corresponding Shabbos. Von die Shabbos zwischen Pesach und Shavuos, and the Shabbos between Pesach and Shavuos. Und aderich sehen die Zumidik Shabbos Bechlal, and in general in the summer Shabbos, later Minik to sagen Pirkei Avos, Kol Shabbos Hakayitz, according to the Minik as is written in the Alter Rebbe Siddur, to say Pirkei Avos all of the Shabbos of the summer. Ubi Inyanenu. Uvibald as design and Dodeus for Paskim. So I'm just going to introduce over here what I'm going to say in the next two paragraphs. Tafshin Lamed Zayin, which is the year that this Farbrengen comes from, was said. Tisha B'av was on, like this year, Tafshin Pei Aleph was on Ches of, Shabbos was Ches of Erev Tisha B'av. Tafshin Lamed Ches, the year that this Likut was published, Tisha B'av was on Shabbos. But either way, Shabbos by Mincha, it's either Tisha B'av or Erev Tisha B'av, and there are different opinions as to whether you say Pirkei Avos. If you say Pirkei Avos, then which is Shabbos Dvarim, then Shabbos Dvarim is Perek Gimel, and then Shabbos Vaeschanan is Perek Daled. If you do not say Pirkei Avos on that Shabbos, then Vaeschanan is Perek Gimel, because you didn't say Pirkei Avos on Shabbos Dvarim. In this Sikha, the Rebbe follows, I don't know if Lamaisa, but the Rebbe follows the day that you would say Pirkei Avos on Shabbos Dvarim, and therefore Shabbos Dvarim is Perek Gimel, and Shabbos Vaeschanan is Perek Daled. and therefore therefore the connection is going to be between Vaeschanan and Perek Dalet. And in order 53 to support this, in order 53 brings that the Ramah says that you don't say Pirkei Avos on Shabbos Tisha B'av or Shabbos Erev Tisha B'av. And however, he says that the minig zet tzarechiyim v'tamua. It's a perplexing minig to not say Pirkei Avos. And the Birkei Yosef says that you are allowed to learn, especially according to our minig, that we're careful to not present any avelis, any signs of mourning publicly by not learning Pirkei Avos. This is avelis b'faresya. And he says you could be medayik from the Alter Rebbe Siddur Kol Shabbos Sakayitz, that you say Pirkei Avos all the Shabbosim of the summer, and he doesn't exclude Shabbos Tisha B'av. And because of that, the Rebbe in this Sikha is going along with the Deya that you do say Pirkei Avos on Shabbos Tisha B'av and Vaeschanan is Perek Dalet. Now, from what I understand, Minig Chabad or Minig, the ungenumen minig is to not say Pirkei Avos, and if I'm not mistaken, in a later Farbrengen, I think it was Tashin Mem Aleph, the Rebbe said that that many don't say Pirkei Avos, so we shouldn't go away from the minig of other people, and the Rebbe indicated, I printed it out and I don't have it in front of me, that to follow the minig of not saying Pirkei Avos on this Shabbos. So Mishnah Achreina is that we don't say Pirkei Avos, but still there is a deya that we do say Pirkei Avos, and like the Rebbe says here in the Sikha, when Mashiach comes, we're going to say Pirkei Avos on this Shabbos. So until this Shabbos comes, until Shabbos Dvarim comes, or until Tisha B'av comes, we could still hope that we're going to say Pirkei Avos on Shabbos Dvarim, and therefore Be'etzem Vaeschanan is connected to Perek Dalet, and therefore the connection we're going to learn today is between Vaeschanan and Perek Dalet. Since there are days in Paskin whether to say Pirkei Avos on the Shabbos, ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, but both are the words of Hashem. Later day as Mazak Yom Pirkei Avos, we're going to explain this according to the day that we do say Pirkei Avos on Shabbos Tisha B'av or Erev Tisha B'av. Especially since we're waiting every single day with this intense desire, intense yearning that Mashiach should come. And these days will become transformed into a Yom Tiv. Is biz bismiches mamish from Shabbos Tisha B'av is das kelel achakem et achuka gedela as lechol days am zagen damas Pirkei Avos. So at least until Shabbos, all the days agree that we're going to say Pirkei Avos on this Shabbos. So therefore, we're going to discuss the connection between Vaeschanan and Perek Dalet. Neisvav der Kol ist die Gescheiches zwischen Parshas Vaeschanan und Perek Revi von Avos. Was man sagt, al pi anal licht im Jahr in Shabbos Parshas Vaeschanan, in addition to the general connection between the two parshas that this Shabbos, this year, we are saying them in the same Shabbos. But in addition to that, was in Zei Beide gefindt men a ribu yon wegen Talmud Torah, will find another connection, and that is that both the parsha of Vaeschanan and the Perek Dalet both have a number of concepts connected to Talmud Torah. Atzol von the tzivuyim of Talmud Torah stay in the Parshas Vaeschanan. A number of the commandments with regard to learning Torah are in Parshas Vaeschanan, and we mentioned them earlier on in the shir. Und eich kama v'kama mishnayis von dem Perek enthalten heroes b'shaychas limud Torah. And also, a number of mishnayis in Perek Dalet contain directives with regards to the limud Torah. But so, in addition to all that connection, gefindt men euch in zwei mishnayis von dem Perek, ahiro v'adgosha meyuchedes, b'negea di zwei yoni bittel anal, was further is about Talmud Torah. But specifically in two mishnahs of this Perek, we're going to find the two concepts, the two ideas of bittul that were mentioned earlier that are necessary when it comes to learning Torah. Mishnah Chaf, Perek Avos says like this: if someone learns Torah as a child, to what is it compared? To ink that is written onto fresh paper. And if a person learns Torah as an older person, to what is it compared? To ink that is written on rubbed out paper. And just like a paper that was used and erased and used and erased, the ink doesn't is not so clear and it doesn't last. So too, the person who used his mind for so many other things, his brain is used up, so to speak, and therefore it's harder for him to retain and absorb the teachings of Torah. That's what the Mishnah says. What's the is that it's glatik, so something is not smooth. We understand the lesson from the first half of the Mishnah, which is encouraging the person about the importance of learning Torah with children, with youth, and not to delay it until he becomes older. We understand, if you learn Torah when you're young, it's going to stick. Why does the Mishnah have to emphasize the caution of the second half of the Mishnah? Is then the Mishnah usen zu sagen, als der was hat nicht gelernt Teire meses sibische Tier, bis is geworden a Socken, darf sich mir ja sein, Chashon von Matzlich sein, lieben der Teire? Is the Mishnah trying to tell us that somebody who, for whatever reason, did not get a chance to learn Teire in his youth, should despair from ever being successful in learning Teire? Like, what's it trying to tell us? In the first half is the positive. So obviously it's encouraging us. The second half is negative. So what's it trying to tell us? There beer in them. So what's the explanation? What's the deeper understanding of this Mishnah? Now is there pirush in Alemeteda Yeled, according to the above, the word we're talking about, bittul over here. So the meaning over here is one who learns Torah as a child, meaning to say as a lernt Torah mit bittul. And as if someone's learning Torah with bittul, he makes himself small like a child. Only then could the Torah be absorbed by him because he's approaching it with bittul. Then is vidiyeksuv on the archadash. Then it's like ink written on fresh paper because it can absorb it and it can retain it. But if the learning Torah is only with his own intellect, with his wisdom, Zaken says here Zaken would be not so much the age, but someone who's using his chachma to learn Torah and not engaging his bittul. On bittul, without bittul, can Torah savaya by him nitnikl ven kidaboy. Then the Torah Hashem could not be absorbed by him properly. And therefore it's not, even though it's also a negative, but it's not saying when you're older, it's not about age. Whenever you approach Torah, you have to approach Torah like a child. Even when you're older, you're learning Torah. Even when you're younger, when you're learning Torah. To approach it like a child means with a bittul, and not like a zaken says, not to feel assured by your wisdom without bittul, because you're not going to retain it. So that's one Mishnah, one very clear, simple Mishnah. If you learn Torah with bittul, then you'll absorb it. If you learn Torah zaken, you learn Torah with your seichel without bittul, then it's not going to last. Then we have Mishnah Yutes, another Mishnah. Shmuel HaKatan says, when your enemy falls, do not be happy. When he stumbles, when he slips, your heart should not rejoice. Because Hashem will see this, might see this, and it will be bad in his eyes. And then he will remove his anger from him. In Bavusti Shaila, there's a very famous question there. What's Shmuel HaKatan trying to tell us? Is a pasuk in Mishlei. It's two psukim in Mishlei. He's Shmuel HaKatan Oimer, and it quotes a pasuk or two psukim from Mishlei. That's all. Go back to the Mishlei and read it over there. What Shmuel HaKatan telling us is Masber the Machzer Vitri. So the Machzer Vitri explains as the pasuk red wegen Amochama Beisek Olam. In the pasuk in Mishlei, he's talking about a fight in worldly matters. Two people get into a fight. Tells you even if you win the fight, don't be happy. When Shmuel HaKatan is Mechadish, Shmuel HaKatan is coming to tell us as Euch Bam Mechamta Shel Torah. That also when it's a battle of Torah between two Talmidei Chachamim that they are arguing with each other when it comes to Advar Halacha, and one was victorious over the other. The victor has to know that he should not rejoice in the fall of his opponent. That he shouldn't be too happy that he was able to be victorious over the other. Similar to the tefillah of Nechonyi ben Akana, he would daven that his friends should not should not stumble, should not make a mistake in the halacha, and that he should not be happy because of it. So in other words, the Machzor Vittel is explaining that Shmuel HaKatan is teaching us that when a person is learning Torah with his friends and he gets into an argument over an inyan in Torah, so he shouldn't be, and he wins the argument, he should not be happy that he was able to win an argument over his friend. So we have to understand this a little bit better. Was ist anders mit Chamta Shel Torah? Was da wollt man gekent meinen, als wenn es meg yes sein Simchas bin a Feiler Yivcha. Und der Vater Shmuel HaKatan war in Kegedem. So the question is, why would I think it's any different? If the pasuk is talking about basic element, when he told me that don't be too happy when your friend falls, when your enemy falls, when your opponent falls, why would I think that Torah is different? That by Torah I should be happy, I could be happy, and Shmuel HaKatan is saying no, don't be happy. Now the Inyan is, wie bald dat man sagt, wenn zweiten in der Halacha, ist es doch nicht seine Sachen, sondern Sache für Torah. Once he was victorious over his opponent in something a part of Torah, so it's not his victory, it's Torah's victory. It says Nizbar Gevaran an Inyan in Torah, an idea in Torah became clear and ratified. Und das darf bei ihm herausgekommen als Simcha Gedola. And truthfully, this should bring out in the person a great joy. That there's another area in Torah that was unclear and now became clear. So comes Shmuel HaKatan and tells us, Yivcha al tismach, wenn ihr wollt gewinnen, geh amer nit wie amitasha shel Torah, wollt sich in sein Simcha nit honor, das is Benefeil Yivcha. If all he cared about was the truth of Torah, then he wouldn't see the fact that his opponent fell. That he was victorious over the other. All he would see was the positive aspect that another area of Torah became clear. The fact that he sees his victory, the fact that he sees the downfall of his opponent means that his yeshus is still mixed in over here, and therefore he's not allowed to be joyful. It's not about him. Noch an Inyan. And really, we could take this to even a deeper level. Wenn wollt gehalten, bei der Zugetragenkeit zum Megala sein Chachmas Yisbarach, if he was truly dedicated, focused on revealing the Eives's Chachma, wollt bei ihm beglandet Gedenken hechlich zu annehmen, das ist ein Fall von der Feile Yivcha. He wouldn't even have to see this as the fall of an enemy. Because both opinions in Torah are still part of the Eibishter's words. The halacha lemaisa can it sein wie beide Deis. Weil in Peil kommen sich für nur wie ein Dei. In actuality, you can't follow both opinions. Aber beide Deis are is galten mit der Elokim Chaim. From the perspective of learning Torah, of words of Hashem, both Deis are the words of Hashem. Und wie bald das noch a viel noch im Psak halacha bleibt die zweite Dei an Inyan von Torah. And even after the Psak halacha that we say we paskin like one day and not the other day still remains part of Torah. Is that their day is nitshayach to sagen bin a fail and echnita yivcha. You can't say that it was a fall. You can't say this is an opponent, this is an enemy, because what he was teaching was still part of Torah. And since in his joy he feels that his opponent was knocked down, he's as simen as in dem that eingemischt der Hergisch von die Danotzach. So this is a sign that this is mixed into this is a feeling of his victory. That he was victorious over the other. When the Far sagt Shmuel HaKatan, therefore comes Shmuel HaKatan and tells us, Shmuel HaKatan was called this because he would make himself small. Shmuel HaKatan is coming from the perspective of bittul, and he says, as limud ateirim was zayin mit a bittul. Limud ateirim must be with a bittul. Azoy has been a feila yivchal tismach. Im is nor negets the gains emes from Torah. The only thing that matters to him is to reach the truth of Torah, and the fact that his enemy was wrong doesn't talk to him. Therefore, there's no reason to be joyful about the fall of the enemy. The only thing that makes him joyful is the fact that he reached Amitas Shel Torah. So what we see from over here is that Mishnah Chaf is addressing the first aspect of bittul. That as a yesod to limud Torah, you have to approach it with bittul. Learn it like a child, like we said, which is consistent with the idea that learning Torah begins from childhood. But then there was another area of bittul. The bittul that comes during the learning, when a person is employing his seichel, that it should become with bittul, so it shouldn't mix in a yeshus. And this is connected with the fact that the limud of a gadol, of an adult, is learned from Vaeschanan levanecha, and this is seen in this Mishnah in Yotes. That when you learn Torah, you shouldn't see the yeshus of it, that you are victorious over the other person. The only thing you should see is that another part of Torah became revealed and clarified and understood. And if you see an oyivcha or a nefayil over here, then you're lacking bittul, and you got to go back to the drawing board. So what we see over here is that these two Mishnahs in Pirkei Avos, which we didn't finish Mishnah Yotes yet, but I'm just pausing here for a moment to point this out, that in these two Mishnahs, in Pirkei Avos and Perek Daled, you see the very two ideas of bittul that we learn, that are necessary by Limud HaTorah, that are learned from Parshas Vaeschanan, from Vaeschanan levanecha. We still have to finish the Mishnah, because the Mishnah continues, Pen Yida Hashem, v'ra be'einav eishev me'alav apeh. What Shmuel HaKatan telling us? Because it's kind of and the Tainus Shmuel HaKatan is saying like this: person could claim, it's true that the opposing opinion is part of the words of Hashem, and therefore it's a part of Torah. The other person wanted to utilize that daya as a practical psak. Which was a mistake. He says, it's not true. The halacha is not like him. So this is, in a certain sense, the fall of his opponent, because the opponent was wrong. So why are we asking him that he should reach a level of that he shouldn't be joyful, and he should, and even more so, that he shouldn't even see it as a fall? By his victory, he cancelled out an area, an idea that wasn't true. And this should bring him simcha. The fact that he was able to prove that was wrong, since that's not the psak halacha, that should be a simcha by him. And this is why Shmuel HaKatan continues. An incredible concept. Es kann sein, das was ein Chaver nicht mechaber given la halacha, ist es nicht mitzad hachasar in sein Seichel. Nur als ein Enes mitzad apei shel maila. Ist nicht sicher zu mechaber sein la halacha. First of all, he doesn't say it over here clearly, I don't think, but he points out in the Farbrengen the word pen. We don't know why the person made a mistake. The other person wanted a paskin Chelek halacha. We don't know why it is. We don't know if it's a lack of understanding, or maybe there was an inyan of apay of the Eibishter, of anger of the Eibishter, that caused the person to not have the schus to be able to come to the proper conclusion. Von dem, was es ist durchgeführt geworden und durch ihm an eines von Eibishten auf jenem. The simcha darf sein nur von dem, was ist das wahre geworden, die Halacha lamitasa. You cannot have any joy from the fact that the other person was wrong. Because it could be the fact that the other person was wrong is something that is connected with the union of Apei of the Eibishter. So it's not like you're smarter than him. It's not like you're better than him. The person was lacking a schus. And therefore the Eibishter gave you the schus that the halacha should be like you. So what are you going to do? Now you're going to be joyful about that? The only thing that should bring you joy is the fact that the halacha was nesbar lamitasa. The other person's being wrong should not play any role in your simcha. If the person will be joyful from the fall of his opponent, is recht, it's possible, as the mitvet der geidem sein, the heishiv me olav apei, the nebis be kaviyachal abkeren apei, von zeh chaver af him. It's possible that the Eibishter will become upset at him, that he's being joyful over his friend's problem, and the Eibishter will then become upset at him, and he's going to lose the schus. So therefore, there's no reason, there's no way that a person should become joyful by the other person's lack of success, and we only focus on the halacha and the amitasa shel Torah. When a person thinks about this, he'll accomplish by himself that not only will he have no joy from the fall of his enemies, by him it will become fulfilled. The opposite, that they will not that even though they argue with each other, nevertheless, they don't move from this spot until they become friends. In other words, they can argue in the ideas, but in their relationship with each other, they are friends. Even more so, Basil and Beishamai argued on certain things that according to Basil, certain noshim it would be a question of an Isha Sish. It would be a question of the legitimacy of the Isha. Nevertheless, the Beis Hillel would marry the Nashim of Beis Shammai, even though they followed the halacha of Beis Shammai, because even though la halacha they disagreed, but nevertheless there was still a friendship and a camaraderie that would go on between the two of them to fulfill the pasuk ha'emes va'ashalom ha'evu. They love truth and peace. And this is how it has to be when it comes to limud HaTorah. That even though when it comes to learning, there is a disagreement, and one could be wrong when it comes to the psak halacha. Nevertheless, the simcha is from concluding the proper psak, and the simcha is never from the fall or from the wrongness of the other person. And we should be zoicha to ha'emes va'ashalom ha'evu, truth and peace amongst us.